Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we are talking about a movement that's been gaining traction, really across the globe. It's called the 4B movement, and it started in South Korea, where women are increasingly choosing to opt out of some traditional societal expectations, things like marriage, childbirth, dating, even heterosexual relationships.
And it's really interesting because this movement is not just about personal choices. It's a direct response to really deeply rooted gender inequality. And it's a really powerful form of protest against a system that a lot of women feel just doesn't serve them.
And that is fascinating. And you know what? Our deep dive today was actually prompted by a question from one of our listeners. They shared an article with us from The Independent. It's called, "What is the 4B Movement and Why Are Women Talking About It in the Wake of Trump's Election Win?" And they asked us to unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this article is it kind of highlights this recent surge in interest in the 4B movement among American women, especially following Trump's victory in the 2024 U.S. presidential election.
That's right. The article even quotes a woman on X Twitter. She said, "American women looks like it's time to get influenced by Korea's 4B movement." So let's start in South Korea. What does 4B actually stand for, and what are some of the driving forces behind it?
So 4B stands for four things. No marriage, which is Bihon. No childbirth, which is Bichulsan. No dating, which is Bionne. And no heterosexual sexual relationships, which is Biseksu. But to really understand this movement, we need to understand the context. So South Korea actually has one of the highest gender pay gaps of all the developed nations. Women earn 31% less than men for doing the same work.
Wow, that's a huge disparity. And the article also mentions some pretty alarming rates of domestic violence.
Yeah, exactly. 1 in 3 Korean women experience domestic violence, and nearly half of those cases are perpetrated by intimate partners.
Yeah.
So these statistics really paint a pretty stark picture of the challenges that women face in South Korea.
Yeah, it certainly puts the 4B movement into perspective.
Right.
In the article, a Busan native named Yeowon is quoted as saying, "Practicing Baihan means you're eliminating the risks that come from heterosexual marriage or dating."
Yeah, and I think that quote really gets to the heart of it. For a lot of women participating in the 4B movement, it really is about mitigating the risks that are associated with traditional relationships in a society where, the patriarchal structures still hold considerable sway.
Yeah, and it's not just about economics and safety, right? The article also delves into some of the social dynamics at play here, specifically the growing education gap.
Yes, and that's another really critical factor. South Korean women are now much more likely to be college educated than men, which has really led to some shifts in the traditional power balance between genders. Yeah, and this educational shift has actually led to some tension. Some men feel threatened by these successful independent women. And the article even mentions this derogatory term. It's called kimchinye, which means kimchi women. And it's used to kind of belittle educated women, comparing them to the fermented staple kimchi. So it's seen as an attempt to kind of undermine their achievements and reinforce those traditional gender roles.
It sounds like there's some pretty complex societal forces at play here, but how does all this connect to the renewed interest in the 4B movement that we're seeing among some American women following Trump's election?
Well, that's where things get really fascinating. The article suggests that both events, while geographically distinct, really speak to this similar underlying tension surrounding gender roles and power dynamics in modern society.
So even though South Korea and the United States have very different cultures, very different political landscapes, there are some parallels in how women are reacting to perceived threats to their rights and autonomy.
Exactly. Remember, Trump has openly celebrated the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and he has a history of making disparaging remarks about women. So his victory in the 2024 election was seen by many as a step backward for women's rights in America.
And that's why some American women are looking at the 4B movement for inspiration. Like they're seeing Korean women taking a stand and saying, maybe we need to do something similar here.
Precisely. And the article quotes anthropologist Trina Orchard, who points out that as women gain more social and economic power, some men feel increasingly constrained and devalued. She says men are feeling constrained, and it's like they might feel like they have fewer options in terms of how to do manhood, and they feel devalued.
And figures like Trump capitalize on this sentiment, promising to restore a more traditional social order where men are firmly in control.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful message for men who feel like they've lost something in the midst of all this social change.
But is opting out of relationships and family life really a viable solution? I mean, it's a pretty radical concept, even for the most progressive societies.
It's certainly a provocative idea. And it's important to remember that the 4B movement isn't this monolithic entity. There are varying degrees of commitment within the movement, and not all women who identify with 4B are completely withdrawing from society.
So there's a spectrum of engagement within the movement.
Absolutely. For some, it might be about consciously choosing to remain single and child-free. For others, it might involve limiting their interactions with men or rejecting those traditional dating norms.
It sounds like the common thread is this desire to reclaim agency and redefine what it means to be a woman in a society that often tries to dictate those terms.
Exactly, and that's what makes the 4B movement so fascinating. It challenges the very foundations of patriarchal systems by rejecting those traditional roles and expectations placed upon women.
It's like saying if the game is rigged, we're not playing anymore.
Exactly, and that refusal to play by the old rules is what makes the 4B movement so potentially disruptive.
But how widespread is this movement, really? The article doesn't give us a clear sense of how many women are actively participating.
Well, that's one of the challenges in studying social movements like this. A lot of the activity happens online, in forums and social media groups where anonymity is often prized, so it's really difficult to quantify its exact size or impact.
But the fact that it's generating so much discussion and debate, even sparking interest across continents, suggests it's tapping into something significant, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it definitely feels like more than just a passing trend. And even if it doesn't translate directly to the American context, it really speaks volumes about the frustrations that a lot of women are feeling right now. Absolutely, and this is where I think it's helpful to consider the 4B movement within a broader historical context. Throughout history, women have consistently challenged these societal norms and pushed for greater equality. The suffrage movement, the feminist movements of the 20th century, these were all reactions to systems that marginalized and disempowered women.
So you're saying the 4B movement is part of this larger continuum of women seeking agency and control over their own lives.
Exactly. And while the tactics and expressions may evolve, the underlying motivation remains the same. It's a desire for a more just and equitable world.
It's interesting to think about how these movements, even those separated by time and geography, can really inspire and inform each other.
Yes, and that cross-cultural exchange of ideas is becoming increasingly prevalent in our interconnected world. The internet and social media allow for this rapid dissemination of information and the formation of these global communities around shared values and concerns.
So could we potentially see a movement similar to 4B emerge in the U.S.?
It's certainly possible. The article from The Independent seems to suggest that the conditions are ripe for some form of collective action, especially given the current political climate and the anxieties that a lot of women are expressing about the future of their rights.
And if something like the 4B movement were to gain traction in the U.S., what might that look like?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's likely that we would see a range of responses, from individual women making conscious choices about their relationships and family planning to more organized efforts aimed at challenging those patriarchal structures and advocating for policy changes.
What stands out to you as our listener from all of this? We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the economic disparities fueling the 4B movement in South Korea to the potential for those similar sentiments to resonate with American women.
I think the key takeaway here is that we're at a pretty crucial juncture in this ongoing conversation about gender roles and equality. Movements like 4B, whether they ultimately succeed or not, force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the ways in which power is distributed in our societies.
It's a call to action, really, urging us to examine our own assumptions, to listen to the voices of those who feel marginalized, and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
And perhaps, just perhaps, movements like 4B, with their bold rejection of traditional norms, might just pave the way for a future where women are truly free to define their own destinies.
So to our listener, we leave you with this question to contemplate. What does the 4B movement mean to you? Does it resonate with your own experiences or observations? And what do you think the future holds for this ongoing struggle for gender equality, both in the U.S. and around the world? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring